I will introduce our wonderful speaker today. Don Dulchinos is an experienced technology industry senior executive and co-founder of Consciousness Hacking Colorado. Don serves as president of Neurosphere Technologies, a research and development company organized around the long-term trend of an interconnected human population. Such interconnection is leveraging technology and the emerging brain-computer interface, BCI, segment. Don is the author of Neurosphere, published in 2005, a book considering the evidence for the emergence of human collective consciousness. He's also chair of the Boulder chapter of Transformative Technologies, a global organization working to apply technology in the service of healing, wellness, and transformation. So please welcome Don Dulchinos.
Thanks, Gloria. Hello, everybody. Everybody hears me okay, I hope? Chat or speak up or go off mute and speak up. Thanks for the introduction, Gloria, so I won't take too much time on that. On this title slide, I like to put all the logos. It's kind of like a NASCAR slide, so you can see, all of my all my sponsors who are not paying me anything at the moment. But I've known Gloria for a couple of years now, and we've worked together in part through my connection with the Consciousness Hacking Meetup group, which is listed here, and I'm still affiliated with them. And we like to co-promote events, and there's somewhat of an overlap in our subject matter, which is good. Then the transformative tech piece is got a little more of a focus around the business side, companies that are building either hardware or software products in the service of mental health and well-being and transformation. And so that part is a little more business focused. And so in this presentation, I won't be talking so much about that part of it, but more around the kind of the central ideas behind it and how we're getting there. So I'm hearing bells. Hopefully people are joining as I'm speaking. So welcome anybody who I haven't said hi to yet.
We've got 10 people, well, including you.
So let's start rolling. And so here's my objectives for today. The term collective consciousness, I hope, caught your attention and has some meaning to you. And I think it has a broad range of meanings to me, ranging from the kind of the spiritual, where I came at it in the first place, to the technology, which brought me kind of back to it in a strange way. So, and really, if I leave you with anything, it's my idea that this is, that the concept is not, in my view, something that's there yet, but is emerging. And we see glimpses of it. We may have experiences that make us think it's there. I think it is emerging over time, and it's times like this when it comes to the forefront and sort of shows itself. And that's kind of what I want to talk about and get your feedback about, because that's and I don't really quite say this, but one of my objectives here is to get some input from you all, because I'm one person that sees one part of this phenomenon, and I think there's a lot of perspectives that I could use to kind of flesh this out. And so the concept collective consciousness sort of implies this kind of global view, all individuals together. But I also mean to cover a little bit about and kind of subsets of that. So any experience of even as few as two people having a common moment, fits the description. But in the long run, I'm trying to find this larger collective and what that means. So work in progress. Your contributions are not only welcome, but required today. So please feel free. So here's an outline, and we've got 2 hours, and I could go longer, but I'm going to try to keep it to this 2-hour kind of version, and we can go shorter. So if people need to drop off, I won't hold that against you. But I think, so the first piece, and we'll talk a little bit about, is what I call global triggers, events that affect everybody on the planet and how those manifest themselves. And that's the first part of it. And then our COVID-19 coronavirus is one of those global events or triggers, and that's the one that actually got me to say to Gloria, this is a good time for us to talk about this topic, because I think we're in it. It's making itself visible in that way. I'll spend a little bit of time historically and talk about, and it's not a new concept certainly to me or anyone recently. It's been around for a while, so we'll talk just a little bit about that. I'll deep dive a little bit on the next topic, which is the evolutionary framework. What I say is kind of the emergence of this idea and this reality over time. And I'll talk about two schools of thought there. One related to Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit philosopher, paleontologist, and the other a topic called spiral dynamics, which is an approach to both evolution and on a personal and a societal level. Gloria has taught a couple of courses on that topic, so maybe some of you have been part of that and know that. Because my professional career is around the technology, I'll talk a little bit about technologies that I think bear on this topic, and I think primarily around telecommunications, brain-computer interfaces, social media, and how those kind of contribute to the current moment. Spend a short amount of time, because I'm not exactly an expert, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the idea of brain versus mind, and how people define the term consciousness. And there's actually a fairly robust scientific conversation that's been going on for the last 20 years or so around what does that mean exactly. So talk a little bit about that. And then I think the personal work is sort of how one engages in this moment, and whether they think that there's a role here for the individual. And that's a piece where I in my experience with Gloria and her audiences and her community, is where probably this group contributes the most, and where I need maybe the most help in understanding. So we'll talk about that. And then what I call the day of 10 billion is, if you follow out the projections in population, we're kind of well on our way to a world population of 10 billion people. And how does that bear on this question? And so we'll talk about that right at the end as a look into the future. So if that's not too much to fit, let's see how we can do here. And I'm going to set a clock over on the side here. I can. There we go. So again, where I'm coming from here is kind of several lines of investigation, and I just summarized them a little bit for you. One is the emergent view. I call that the integral stages of development. Again, both individual and societal development. One is the science of consciousness. Again, the kind of scientific study of what is that? Is there anything different between consciousness and brain, and how do you study it? And then the technology piece around brain-computer interfaces. So all of them bear on the issue, and I'm trying to get smarter about each of them over time, and they're still making me think that they do come together in this collective idea. So in the current moment, so March 11 was when I was on the phone with some friends. We were about to have lunch on Friday that week, and they're work friends that I have known for a while, 5 of us, and we were discussing, are we going to have lunch, or what's happening with this coronavirus thing? And the word at that point was just coming around, right? That you should expect that we're going to start shutting down movement. Already companies are asking people to stay home. It was just starting. If you kind of think back to that, it seems like a long time ago, only 2 months ago. And at that moment, I was texting with a friend who was on the East Coast, and we were kind of going back and forth, and I said this is as weird a feeling as I've had since 9/11. It's a weird feeling. It's not, I'm not scared. I'm not excited. It's just a feeling that I have about apparently every 20 years, right? And I sent that message to him, and he sends back, minutes later, I was just saying that to my daughter, same exact thing. And with him, a little more emphasis because he was living in New York City around 9/11, so he kind of knows wherever he speaks. But that's why I call this a trigger. It's an event that got me thinking back about this idea. Gloria mentioned that I'd written a book, 15 years ago on the topic, and mentioned 9/11 back then. And then over time, a lot of what I wrote, I kind of feel like, it was a little sketchy. I wasn't quite on top of the subject matter. And then here we are again, and I'm really thinking about all of those issues again. So that's where I wanted to go into the first interactive piece of this. And so this is, there's no right answers, and and nobody has to respond, but I'd love to hear people come off mute and just, give me 25 words or less of when did you first realize that this was a kind of a major global event, as well as a major personal event for you? And how did you feel at the time, and how do you feel now? Is it still the same, or have you gotten used to it, or is it still kind of a strange thing? Gloria, maybe you want to go first just to get things started?
Okay. How did I feel when I first realized how the pandemic might affect us? I think I felt nervous, didn't know what to expect. Started hearing about, my initial response was my daughter was in Italy when it blew up there. And I really wanted her to come home right away. And she was having such a good time. She said she was extending her vacation for another week, which I was not happy about. And but she said she was with her boyfriend, and she said they had left the north when word started breaking out. And she said, "We're okay. We're not in the north. We're in the middle of the country." And I said, "And you don't think that people on the plane coming home are going to be, include people from the north?" But anyway, they had a great time. They got on the plane to come home just before the borders closed from Italy, or just before, Italy couldn't come here anymore. And they arrived safely, went into quarantine for 2 weeks on their own up in the Catskill Mountains, and they were fine, thank God. But so that was my first response. And how do I feel now? I feel a combination of a lot of things. I'm very busy with Caritas, and and I love so many of the things that we do, my classes and everything. So I'm busy enough, and yet there seems to be behind that. I mean, I don't have as much time for reflection as I might like to, considering I really feel this is a time for reflection. I feel a collective angst very much present in my, normal. It's kind of in the background. It's hard to explain, but I do feel that. I feel, of course, the sadness of so many people dying, but also I feel excitement about the possibilities that, that might come of this, and knowing a little bit of the history of things that have come from other crises and pandemics. I feel, hope that I feel a hopefulness that good things will come out of this. And I'm a little bit, I wish I could do more to bring that about. And that's a question I'm asking myself every day. What can I do as an individual? So anyway, I'll stop there so other people can talk.
Okay. You want to help me call out other names? Okay, I can't see the names.
Oh, how about Kitty?
Oh, I have to,
Kitty, you've got to unmute.
or I have to, maybe.
It's me.
There you go.
So with us, we're both retired, and so the concept of staying at home hasn't been an issue. The delivery of groceries is kind of a plus, and so from a very day-to-day mundane thing, everything is pretty much like it was before. From an emotional, psychological, it's quite a shocker to see how what a monstrous change has taken place. It's watching all the kids not go back to school after spring break and that sort of thing, major big deal. The other thing is, of course, the economy, and a lot of people we know are quite affected by that. And so, like Lori said, it's hard to know exactly what to do. We've done the few things we know how to do that we think make some sense, but it's really not our thing to sit quietly with our hands folded in response to a crisis. And so I think that if we had to name the thing that has been the most stressful is, oh my gosh, the world's falling apart and we're supposed to sit home with our hands folded and have people bring groceries to us.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Great. Thanks.
How about Kathy?
Well, at first, I don't know. I don't remember exactly when we heard about it, but I thought, oh my gosh, the way they were treating it, every third person was going to die. And so actually before that, when they were saying, you better curtail your travel and so forth. And I thought, I'm not giving into this fear. I'm going to do it anyway. And then as it turned out, yes, to be responsible, you really should stay home and so forth. And then thank goodness I didn't cancel that travel because, the flights were so, disrupted and so forth. It would have been horrible. But over time, I still don't know of anyone who has it myself. And I read about it and so forth. And yes, we were impacted financially, but kind of like Gloria, I think we need something like this to shake us up and get us out of being so complacent and complicit in not caring for one another and not caring for our environment and the economic dysfunction. Everything's so dysfunctional. Then I look at it as really kind of a blessing. And as far as how I feel now, it doesn't seem to have had really much of an impact on my world or those around me. So I feel good and hopeful, and there's just a lot of good things that have come out of it already. So I'm good.
Good. Maria?
So I think I also, like Kathy, came from a perspective of I'm not gonna fall into the trap of being fearful of this. And I think maybe I was more well, if it's my time to go, if it's COVID, I'm ready, or if it's going to be walking down the street, I'm ready, So I kind of was, I don't know if I would say open to this whole thing, like saying, I trust that whatever is happening for a good reason. It affected, I'm a teacher, so we had to go into remote learning. I work as many hours, if not more, than I used to when I was teaching at school. But I am about to end the school year. And so I'm really looking forward to spending a little bit more time in nature and maybe disconnected from the computer that's in front of me. So anyway, but I do miss engaging physically with other people. I think the thing I most miss is going to restaurants, and engaging with the waiters. We have waiters that we know in all sorts of different restaurants that we like to visit. And anyway, I guess I miss that connection when we're there together. So
Zoom lunches.
Thanks.
Zoom lunches. Carol? Unmute.
Sorry, just took me a minute to get my mouse over there. Hi. I too am a school teacher. It was a very difficult end of year. I know a lot of families are very scared and many of them out of work. And I am grateful beyond measure for having employment. How did I feel when you first realized how it might hit us? I wasn't sure, because I've been hearing conspiracy theories for so many years that I had kind of come to the conclusion for myself that if it's my time to go, I've had a heck of a life. And, not to say that I'd like to go early, but, I have lived well. Lots of great experiences. And how do I feel now? I don't know. There is so much misinformation out there on both sides of the fence that I don't know what to think. I'm kind of at a standstill. Personally, I have started my groups back up in my home, and masks are optional. I hug people that come to my door that are wanting a hug or open to that. I have kind of reached a point of I'm kind of done. It's a virus. We're going to probably need to have exposure at some point, hopefully when we're younger and healthier, so that we can build an immunity. And I know there's two sides of that fence too. So I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss with all of it.
Thank you.
Okay, Jackie?
I felt that this was kind of a slowly boiling kind of volcano, because I kept hearing about some friends that in January and February had very, very tough cases of flu, but they weren't diagnosed as to what type of flu they were. Some of them had pneumonia. I do know two nurses that both got COVID, one on the East Coast and one right here in Boulder. These were both hospice nurses. I know of someone else who flew on an Air China flight, not from China, but from San Francisco to the East Coast. It was like a little branch flight that she took. And perhaps the plane was not well sanitized, but she got a case of what she called very, very bad flu that just knocked her out. So I had a feeling it was a feeling of something was going, and then in March we had the chance to have a in-person group. I'm the facilitator of a local Boulder group, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and also a spiritual emergency group that has combined with it. And we had to cancel our group because we have a number of older members that we didn't want to just get into a situation where they said, yeah, I got it at your group meeting. So we just canceled it was actually our March 7th meeting. So we weren't quite, we're a little bit earlier than Don and his March 11th, but March 7th, we got out of the loop. And how I feel now, I feel like this, for some people, is the chance for a transformational experience that they might be able to take with them for the rest of their lives for a positive way, as opposed to some people I've talked with that are just whining and complaining and have become very antagonistic about it. And those people now I'm trying to stay away from because they are so negative. I just say we're all in this together. We can ride this out. We can do the best we can with our resources and the fact that we do have some spiritual and consciousness background to rely on. So that's kind of what's happening up here in North Boulder. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Gloria, Gloria, we have anyone left, or I lost count? Did we lose Gloria?
I'm sorry, I was muted and didn't realize it. Suzanne, do you have anything to add?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My first realization was, oh no, it's here, because I had heard about there would be a pandemic many years ago from a spiritual advisor that I associate with, and that the spiritual lesson was going to be an exercise in fear. How fearful are you? And so on. And I do believe, and I agree, that this is an opportunity for spiritual growth and a transformation. When one is in fear, it's false evidence appearing real. However, I do think that the virus is real and the effects are real. And I do know a couple of people who have had a very difficult time with it. They did survive it. So I realized personally, I'm retired also, that my lifestyle wouldn't change too much. However, as time went on, I realized that I do enjoy my socializing, going out to restaurants, shopping, being with friends and so forth, and that's changed a lot. But, once you get used to the idea of a little social distancing, wearing masks and so forth, it isn't so bad. You can adjust to that. I do not approach it in fear, but more out of consideration for others. I do think it's a prudent thing to do, all the recommendations that have been made. So as far as, a little bit more personally, I do think that it has changed some of the ways that I had intended to behave with some of the research and work that I do. Everybody is kind of more or less just like we're doing now. We're having a Zoom meeting instead of in person. And I do miss the physical, interpersonal relations that we have so enjoyed before. And I'm hoping that that's going to change. But by being inside, being with ourselves more, I think it's good for families to get to know each other better, for everyone to have a little more internal reflection. And that can only, I think, be for the good. That people realize what's really, really important in their lives, their loved ones, their good health, the fact that their needs are met for the most part, and so on. So those are just a few comments I have about it. Thank you.
I can say just very quickly, my first realization is actually before it hit the country. My brother lives in Ireland, he's married to a doctor, and my parents arrived in New Orleans just 4 days before the borders were closed. And so my brother called us kind of in a panic saying, they have to come back. It's going to be really bad. And I had no clue at that point. I was like, well, what are you talking about? It's just a bad flu. And kind of shook me up a little bit. But so, the initial response was maybe a little denial. I didn't go into fear, and now I feel very fortunate and grateful to be in the circumstances I'm in. The fact that my parents are still stuck in New Orleans, but they're safe and doing well. I have people around me. There's a pool of people we can actually hug, and yeah, I feel very fortunate. But I'm very, very curious about hearing more about your presentation, Don.
All right. So again, thank you everybody for speaking up. Yeah, and it's both a kind of a variety of responses, but also a lot of common themes in there too. And one of the things I liked is, several of you talk about, kind of expecting to experience fear going into this, but not really actually having that happen. And the other side, overwhelmingly on the other side, kind of, how do you feel now, is wanting to get back with other people, right? Reestablishing those connections. And I think that's maybe obvious. Somebody mentioned having, worried about your kids. My son came home from college early on. The campus actually was closed, so he had to come home. And so, getting to know your family again, right? My wife and I are very happy with having our son home, getting to know him better. He's not so happy to be home, living with a couple of old guys, So it kind of cuts both ways. But he's doing great. And my daughter, who was in New York City when this happened, and she was there for 6 weeks with a roommate, 2 roommates in a small apartment in New York City, and they both went out and a week and a half ago rented a car and drove to Wisconsin, where the roommate's family was, and spent 5 days there, and then drove here to Colorado and spent 5 days here. And that was an interesting, I think they were violating curfew or something by doing that, but they felt a really strong need to do that, just to get in. I wasn't crazy about the idea, but neither was I living through this in New York City, where it really is, everybody knows a lot of people who are suffering from the disease. So a lot of reactions, a lot of responses. I'll come back to some of those as we walk through here. So let me go another slide or two forward. And the interaction here is so good that I'm going to speed through some slides, because this is the interaction I want, and we don't need to really worship the slides. And so I went back in history, and I've talked about some of this in my previous book about other kinds of triggers that are global triggers, things that affect, if not everybody, a lot of people. And the quotes, and so these are obvious, hopefully to all of you, World War II, 9/11. Climate change is interesting because it's more of a slow motion event. It's affecting us all, but it's hard to get, for some people, to get their arms around it, right? And then I looked on the right-hand side, I thought, well, how do people kind of react to this? And these kinds of global moments. And, in the wake of World War II, we have the United Nations, a concept that had been tried with the League of Nations and then failed. And we've had that as a reaction. And I think, I don't know how all of you feel, but I think a lot of people feel that itself as an institution is not that effectively a global institution. And I'll come back to that thought a lot. Of when I think of global things, I think of institutions. I think of Doctors Without Borders. I think of the United Nations, and they're institutions. They're set up to address global problems, but they all seem kind of hamstrung in their ability to actually be effective. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. The reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union, if you remember, George Bush the First talking about, well, it's a new world order, and kind of where us Americans are in first place, and that didn't work out quite that way, right? 9/11, which to me was sort of one of those, I forget which of you said, this is a time when you address transformation. This is an opportunity. And there was an opportunity that was I thought badly missed by declaring, here's how we're going to think about this global event. It was a war. It's a global war. And maybe that was the wrong way to go. So we react, but the reactions might not be helpful. They might be the opposite of helpful. And that's what I worry about, kind of where we're at right now. climate change, okay, again, kind of a global event that's kind of hard to get your arms around. I thought green for all, that term of art was a great one. Because part of the reaction, the initial reaction for people like me, I come a little bit out of the environmental movement, is great. You know, I was right. People weren't listening. Environmental issues are important. But then there was a whole section of the population in the U.S. that was feeling like environmental protection was actually hurting them economically. Right? And so this kind of formulation seems to kind of address an issue in an effective way. We'll see whether that goes through. And so all of these, I think the great pause to talk about this moment is a terrible formulation, but I don't have a better one. And then here is, Gloria, one thing I want to ask you is to distribute the slides to this group afterwards. Maybe we should have done it in advance because I don't want to read these, but this is an excerpt from a book called Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon, novel. And it came out after 9/11, but this particular passage was about 9/11. And, but the analog was to the people in Russia and Siberia when this great event happened in 1908, which was, people think, a meteor or a comet crashed, massive destruction. Some people thought, oh, it was a UFO crash, right? Maybe somebody may have heard this. But it was a mystery. Nobody really knew how to describe it. And he used the phrase, the event of 30th of June. And that's exactly how I remember 9/11. And at least before it was labeled a global war on terror, people talked about not an attack even, but the events of 9/11, right? If you remember that, it's kind of we never see anything like this. We don't know how to even name it. And so that was one thing about this is his commentary, I think, on 9/11. These things are hard. When they hit this kind of global consciousness, it's hard to get your arms around them and label it the right way, in a big enough way. The second part is this highlighted piece, which is the early rise, the sense of overture and possibility. And a couple of you mentioned this here, is like, now that we're coming maybe out of this, it's an opportunity. What are we going to do with the opportunity? And I think that's really important going forward to kind of keep that in mind. And to me, it's thinking about the opportunities not only to connect on a personal level, but what's the global response? How are we going to get back in our individual lives? Some people are going to go and not wear masks. I mean, or is there a common way to go at this? So that brings us to the virus itself as a global event. And all through the rest of this presentation, I talk about metaphors for collective consciousness and then sort of verifiable reality evidence of the phenomenon. And the virus has this too, right? And before, it's interesting to me as a technology guy for years, talking about things that go viral, right? Now it's the kids own this, right? Viral memes on social media. And even then, even as a metaphor, it was both fun, spread memes about my favorite, hip hop rapper, and also not so pleasant. And the backs and forths on politics, terrorism, and how terrorist acts kind of there's copycat crimes and acts of terror, and it's got this viral nature to it, even though it's not a physical virus. It's a metaphor, fairly accurate in terms of how it works. I'll come back to Trump's election in a different slide because you could go all day on that one. But here we are, and now it's a real thing. But even the virus is hard to define. And I actually had this conversation a while back about. I'm trying to remember my high school biology. Is a virus a living thing or is it not a living thing? And does everybody know this? It's like the answer is, well, sort of, right? It's not quite. It can't reproduce itself, but it reproduces within a host like us. So it's hard to get a handle around that even as a reality, even as a scientific reality. And then the last piece, again, along the lines of having an optimistic response to this is a number of people lately have pointed out that the Great Black Plague in the Middle Ages was followed fairly shortly by the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. And so maybe there's hope there. I don't know if anybody noticed over my shoulder here, the mask on the wall. Can you guys see that? Everybody know what that is?
That's what the doctors wore during the Black Plague.
Exactly. It's a plague mask.
Yeah.
I picked that up on a vacation in Italy. I don't know, it's 4 years ago now. And I had that stored somewhere else, and I pulled it out for, I don't know why. And now it's like, oh.
They would fill the beak with fragrant herbs to
exactly
cut the smell of.
Well, A, to help the smell, and B, to filter, they thought, whatever it was that was contagious. Yeah. So there's I think positive ways to look at this. So I'm going to skip this piece. We'll do some more interaction later. And I'm going to skip most of this, other than to say collective consciousness is not a new idea. Certainly, it's a kind of ancient religious article of faith in a lot of spiritual traditions. Teilhard de Chardin, as a Jesuit, talked about. The word neurosphere, by the way, in my company, in my book, was a takeoff of Teilhard's coining of neurosphere, which is, a thinking layer around the planet, just as the atmosphere is the gaseous layer around the Earth. But he also came out of a Jesuit tradition, so to him, he was trying to unify science and religion, the idea of the body of Christ, and that Christ was the ultimate, unification with Christ was the ultimate end point of human development. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. The Jung, the collective unconscious, here in Boulder, everybody knows about Carl Jung, right? Or we have any Jungian analysts on the call?
You have a Jungian dream worker.
That counts, right? Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah. Also, Rupert Sheldrake's, can't think of the word now. His Maria, you love that. What? the morphogenetic field.
Morphogenesis, right?
Right.
Yep. That's great. Yep. That's another one. Interestingly, someone who was it, Jackie, talked about you manage the near-death experience group locally, and there was a concept that came out 20 years ago, when near-death studies, I think, was just starting, right? Mind at large, and something rising up in response to what was perceived as a collective near-death experience, and that was at the time it was thought of the nuclear standoff. And now we've got, climate change, we've got pandemics, other kind of spurs to that idea. Jackie, did you want to say anything about that? I just think that's interesting.
Well, I'd just say that we do have some research now that points to a collective near-death experiences for soldiers in battle or people under certain extreme crisis situations. Might be in a collective field and perhaps have near-death experience or out-of-body experience collectively, and then come back and have a new type of collective resonance. So, there's more and more of that going on. So you could take that whole idea into this whole thing with the pandemic. And I suspect people already have, because there's a British researcher who's going to do a Zoom class very soon for the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, or ASSIST, open to the public. He's going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic as a spiritually transformative experience. So
that's what I've been hoping to hear about.
It's just going. It's going.
When is that, Jackie?
I think it's the 28th
Of this month?
of May.
Oh,
Yeah.
Speak. If
But
you wouldn't
if you-
mind, do you have a link to that? If you could put it in the chat box.
I can send the website, and you can go on the website for Assist, and they're also having a sharing group on all different topics coming up, and it's a very interesting group. So,
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Okay, so goes without saying. There's lots of thinking in this area. So the last one here is Global Brain Institute is actually an organization in Europe, in Belgium, of computer scientists and people who think about software and artificial intelligence and things like that. And they have kind of done what they would consider a mathematical proof that the more and more people are tied together through the internet, and that the bandwidth gets bigger and more information is exchanged, that we're effectively a global brain. And they consider that a tangible, like not a metaphor, but an actual thing. And I think that's interesting, but they're computer scientists. Do we have any computer scientists on the call before I insult them? Well, even if I would do this. I have friends who are computer scientists. But it implicit in that thinking is that computation equals consciousness. That's the sum total of all of your computation is your consciousness, and that's not a surprising view from a computer scientist, but I think it kind of falls short of the definition, and I'll talk a little more about that later. So here, it's sort of it's where there's the metaphor breakdown. We know that neurons and a lot of other structures comprise a brain, but is any individual neuron aware that it's part of this brain? And so by the same token, could an individual even be aware, if there were such a thing as a global consciousness, that they were part of it, in a sense? And I'm kind of on the side of, I think, only very vaguely. And it's only at these moments where I feel like I've got some of a glimmer of what that is. And so that's an important question throughout, I guess, the rest of my presentation here. And the other question to ask as we go along is about evolution, because evolution is a thing. It's a historical fact. It's a scientific fact. And it doesn't just stop. It is happening as we speak. And so you might reason, and so this is where we bridge into Teilhard, is what's the next step in evolution as it affects the human. So that's so there's two kind of, and so again I talk about evolutionary or emergent frameworks, as I don't really know what's coming or what's going to happen, but people have thought about it and kind of drawn a projection of where they think things are going that seems to point to a collective idea of consciousness. And one of them is Teilhard on the left, and the other is a psychologist named Claire Graves. And hey, Gloria, are any of the folks here have been through your spiral dynamics sessions?
let's see. Kitty did. Anybody else in this group? I don't think so.
Okay, which is fine. I'm going to, in a sense, I'm going to go very quickly across the surface of this, but, you both should feel free to chime in. So Teilhard was, as I said, a loyal Jesuit. Both my kids have been to Jesuit colleges, so I'm a great fan of Jesuit teaching. They're very, very logical thinkers and very comprehensive thinkers, but they are loyal Catholics, and so it's always an interesting balance. And so consequently, this book, Teilhard wrote a lot in his lifetime, and most of it was not published because the church, he submitted it dutifully to his superiors in the church, and they said, yeah, that's a little out there, keep thinking, but you may not publish that. The Phenomenon of Man came out in the late 40s, I think early 50s, and created quite a sensation because it did try to reconcile the science of evolution, which as a paleontologist, he knew was true, with his religion, which he also believed was true. And I thought it was always interesting and so that's the kind of the summary of where Teilhard was coming from. As I said, he created this concept of the noosphere. But I pulled out a couple of quotes here from both The Phenomenon of Man, I think some other publications. And not only was he a biological scientist, but he was also a student of technology. And in several places, he talked about the use of radio communications as something that links us all together. In fact, in that first sentence, he goes right to it. Right? Link us all in sort of an etherized universal consciousness. It is an anticipation of telepathy. And it's in characterizing the development of electromagnetic communication as a prodigious biological event is just how he kind of poetically kind of wedded all these things together. And we're talking when he was writing some of this in the 1930s, 1920s even. It triggered his thinking about kind of all of this. And so he expected to see, at the end of the day, at some point in the future, a harmonized collective consciousness or super consciousness. And the earth enclosed in this single thinking envelope. And even there, he kind of meant it literally. And yet there's very little evidence that he would have to say that that's actually there. So all of this thinking caught the attention of people like me back in the 1980s as we were introduced to this concept of the internet, or this technology of the internet. And the more we saw how it was growing, how it was interconnecting, this guy was talking about this. And so there's quite an underground of computer scientists then and technologists who were big fans of Teilhard. And I think he's having a moment again, kind of now. Won't get into too much of this. Some of his biology is a little loose, biologists would say, but he looked at the evolution through living beings up through mammals and then to the human. And a striking thing about the human evolution is unlike other species where you have several species of millions of species of insects and hundreds of species of dogs and of apes, but there's only one species of the human that has the kind of brain we have. And so it was for him, it was a convergence and a unification of the species, and he just saw that was a trend that he projected would continue. So you can argue, and biologists do argue about that, but anyway, that's where he was coming from. And so these are the terms he threw out in the world, the evolution of the planet to a biosphere to a noosphere. And sometimes you call that the omega point as an ultimate destination and a final thing, because that's what the Bible teaches. The other philosopher we're going to talk about is wouldn't call it an omega point, but he would call it an advance, but not the final advance. So we'll talk about him in a minute. Okay. I was just checking the chat window. Thanks, Jackie, for posting that information about assist. So switch over then quickly to Claire Graves. So that's this is my a page from my notes from March 5th of 1976 when I was sitting in a class with this professor of organizational psychology named Claire Graves. And as any young idealistic student, I was wondering about where my education was going. I thought I was an economics major because it seemed practical, but it was not talking about philosophy. It was not talking about psychology and things that I was interested in. So and the idea that there was a career path, I would be an economist and I would go into business and make a living. So this guy was teaching a course on organizational psychology. And I thought, oh, great, I'll learn how to be a manager. And so the first couple of classes were about management. And then all of a sudden he says, okay, I'm going to talk about, everything I've been teaching you comes from my theory of adult human development and how people grow and change. And he puts up this graphic. And so that's my little sketch of what he looked like, because he was in his mid-60s when I took the course, and he was not in good health. But he actually had this little wry grin as he presents this entire theory of human evolution and psychology, to these undergraduates who thought they were going to get a different kind of education. And the one thing that struck me was that that consciousness changes within a human over time, which was not surprise. Graves was a contemporary of Maslow. Psychologists in the 50s and 60s had a number of different human development kind of levels and stages, and they were all fairly similar, actually. But his model was, it kind of took it a little further and said not only do humans develop, but then any given society is defined by the collection of humans within it and what stage of development they're at. And so you can have primitive societies, you can have advanced societies, and actually broke that down into kind of an 8-step process. So although he was not well known when he died in the 70s, he's had a couple of disciples who carried on his teachings, and then some of that actually was adopted by Ken Wilber, the local integral philosopher here. Do folks in this group know Ken Wilber pretty well? Can I assume that?
Not personally, but
his institute and teachings. So he has a developmental model that he borrowed from Graves in part. And so this is the Graves model. I'm sorry for this slide, and I don't mean to speak to this, but his fundamental characteristic of this is that it is a spiral, and that any human in any society goes through developmental stages. And so in an individual human development, starting at the bottom of this spiral is, survival, right? A baby just is looking to eat and sleep, right? And just survive. The purple is sort of a tribal organization of thinking, where's my family? Am I near my family? Where's my family? And then as a child grows, becomes a teenager, is very impulsive, very egocentric. That's the next. So these are just common stages, right? That all individuals go through. Up to a point, there's support for. I'm looking for my more advanced tribe, but what's my local society? What's my church? What's my community look like? And those are the values I start to adopt as a adolescent, and then as a young adult, and then it, as a matter of human development, there may or may not come further stages. And so the next stage is just, the colors are somewhat arbitrary, but the orange stage here, talking about self-interest, but as an adult, how do you get ahead? And it's often associated with economic activity by an individual. Do you go into business? Do you play the stock market? That's sort of the kind of extreme version of the orange kind of meme. And then the final one that kind of only appeared really in large numbers starting after World War II is not accidentally labeled with the green color, but more egalitarian, communitarian, environmental, have a sense of community that goes beyond the local community. So these are stages that, again, he had evidence that, many individuals go through. And over time, and the thing that caught my attention was over time, the center of gravity shifts upwards in the nation and in the world, that more and more people are in these higher stages over time. And it's tricky because, and it's spiral because the the movement from one stage to another is not a smooth one. It's not just a straight upward arrow. It is often at the point of transition, it's pretty violent. It's pretty, not physical violence, but a lot going on that people are trying to, gather themselves to make that leap to the next level. And there's often, it feels like they're going backwards. And so if you think about a left-right axis on this spiral, that sometimes it seems like you're going backwards, but you're actually, you're consolidating and you're ready to make the move upward to a higher stage. So all of this very emergent, very evolutionary kind of point of view. And maybe I should stop there, Gloria, and see if I've gone too fast or if I've lost everybody. But what do you think I need to add there?
Maybe
Just the
any
basics.
questions on that?
Okay, sure.
Anybody have any questions or comments on spiral dynamics or any of the other topics that have been covered so far?
And don't be shy. I should add that I spent 20 years later after college. There was a course by one of Graves' disciples here in Boulder, and it was a week-long course, eight hours a day, to get some kind of basic certification training. So
Yeah, it's a huge.
takes a
I have
while
a
to get it.
question.
Yes, please.
So this green stage, Donald, what do you do about individualism? First of all, I am a master's degree cultural anthropologist, okay? So I see what you're talking about in the degrees, generally speaking. Is a cultural consciousness we're talking about here, in my view. And it has aspects of all levels, including spiritual, of course. So this egalitarian thing, do you think everybody's going to be the same? How do you deal with individualism at that stage?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's not unique to that stage either. And the cadence here kind of alternates between kind of an active stage where you're developing and you're more individualistic, and then you go to the next stage and it's about community values. And so that's even at the purple tribal stage. That's a community, but there's individuals within it. As they get more individual and they act out and they want to break out of that they are viewed by their community as rebels, outcasts, and it's not a good thing. And yet they will not stop. They would normally transition to a higher level of organization. And so maybe that's a transition from tribal community to a urban community. And I think it's important not to think that these are that there's some kind of good or bad. That it's always good to be at the higher level. There is bad behavior at every level, and that's one key lesson here. But in the general premise is going to a higher level creates more good for more people for more of the time. There is a value associated with that. So an urban community or a more sophisticated community might have a greater chance of survival than some at the tribal level.
Sure.
So the same thing is supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, you kind of go from act on your own self-interest to not necessarily giving up on self, but doing many, many things in service to others, which is a highly spiritual part of growing up, of transforming into that. So that not that everybody is the same, but you see the soul, the spirit in everyone as developing, and as an individual with what other talents you bring into your life, you share that with others for their best benefit, I guess you could say, as well as your own.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Sure, absolutely. There's good at all of these levels. Don't mistake that. But yeah, that's right. It's an interesting thing then. So at the green level, there are, in fact, when you get training, you go through a test of where are you? Where's your center of gravity here? And I ended up square in the green, and I was feeling good about myself until the guy who was running the program said, "Yeah, the problem is green folks think they know everything, and they tend to lecture people. And the further down the spiral you go, especially in the red, people do not like to be lectured to. And so even though you're trying, you think you're trying to bring people, more, survival values, more spiritual development, they don't see it that way. And so you're not quite communicating. And so this is the more dynamic part of the theory is you have to think about how you communicate across levels. And so that let me get to that next. But any other questions before I go from here?
I'd just like to point out that each succeeding level on the spiral alternates between focus on the individual and focus on the community, and then focus on the individual and focus on the community. So, and green is not the highest level, it's just the highest level in what they call the first tier. And then you go into the second tier, and there's yellow and turquoise and coral. Yeah, there you go. Good segue.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the straight line. The conversation that's going on now, and I'm going to come to I'll spend a few minutes on an example of the application of this more societally, culturally, with the example of politics, since we're all, it's in our face these days. But the prediction that Graves had was that you would have to go back to this individual alternation, which in this case would be the yellow, and reach back down through the levels and be able to communicate to all of them. And so this, he predicted, would be to go from the 6th to the 7th level here would take longer and would be much harder than the previous stages. And so let me talk about that. This is nobody has measured this stuff over 4 centuries, but looking back at history and thinking where were people at any point in time, in the year 1600, let's see if I've got this. So at these stages, so the green across the board is what percentage of the population was in at that level at that time. And so basically there's progression over time culturally across all cultures in the world to higher levels over time. So it's a very optimistic view of life in that way, but it doesn't mean there aren't problems regardless of that. This I think I should skip, but this is the Ken Wilber kind of theory in a one graph. It talks about lines of development from the inside, the center of the outwards. So there's a stage growth there, but he just divides up kind of how your individual on the left side, on the upper left, how an individual develops, and with sort of a subjective view of that. The right side presumes that there's a objective view of that you would see different, measurable behavior, different measurable biology that associated with those higher levels, which is interesting. And then on the bottom half is sort of the cultural view of the same thing. So it's this has some value also, but at the end of the day ends up at the outer edges of these arrows as saying, that there's a point at which an integral community, a collective community is more and more evident. And so Wilber claims to have that sort of have documented cross-culturally across different theorists, that everybody kind of ends up with that as what they think is going to happen. So I think I just said all this. The key point here, so I think the second bullet here is what I was trying to say to you, Shirley, is, the progress through the stages should lead to more beauty, more good, more truth over time for more people, more fulfillment of more of the needs. Not that other levels weren't satisfying some people some of the time and didn't have good qualities. But importantly, and what keeps us from being just kind of a utopian, oh, things are going to end up great, is that each stage, culturally especially, brings new life conditions and new challenges. And the one, just given some of my background that I think about, is how the industrial era brought progress in a lot of dimensions, but then it brought pollution and it brought environmental degradation. And suddenly there's everything that worked for you to build an industrial civilization is suddenly no longer working for you. It's actually killing you unless you can get to that next level and figure out how to preserve kind of the best of both worlds, as it were. So every stage has its own life conditions. And by the way, to the earlier point, if you're at a kind of a green stage and you're trying to communicate to a red stage, the lower stages can't actually see what you see. They almost literally can't see it. What they see is what's in front of them. Is like, I have a job in a coal mine. If I don't have a job in a coal mine, my family's not going to survive. Don't tell me about CO2 levels in the atmosphere. I literally can't see it, can't understand what you're talking about. So you need a different kind of communication to bridge that gap. So another kind of outcome of this theory is that you can practice, you can progress, you can move to higher stages over time. You have to be careful. There's a trap I fell into that you can get to higher states different ways, meditation, drugs, but don't confuse that with the idea that you might be at that more enlightened stage all the time. You need to kind of reintegrate experiences, and so it's tricky that way. But nevertheless, there are more and more techniques, I think, for helping people move up those levels if they want to, as individuals, and then some political cultural movements that are helping address that societal growth as well. But it's a hard moment for that right now, and this is why it's hard. This is who's responsible for it being so hard. A couple of these notes come from a book called Trump in a Post-Truth World, which is a Ken Wilber book, recent book. But it kind of illustrates the point, right? Is that the political system, in terms of people's stages of development, looks kind of like this in the United States. Interestingly, if you look at a lot of Western Europe, you'll see more green and less red and blue. And so sort of American exceptionalism is not advantaged by this view, but this makes sense to me. So as we talked about earlier, the green stage stresses unity, equality, but there's facts on the ground among the red and blue communities that undermine what seems obvious to people at that stage. Where's my equality of income? That's kind of a big deal. So Trump, as sort of, to me, an idiot savant. He doesn't really know what he's doing, but he tapped into this. And if you think about especially the crazies that make good television, who are angry, they're angry, but they don't even have a left-right view of this. They just, I'm angry, and nobody's recognizing that I'm angry. And so this guy seems to recognize that. So I'm going to vote. I don't even know what his politics are. I'm going to vote for him. And so that's, sort of a Gravesian, Wilberian view of how that developed. And again, just as I said before, green leaders tend to be seen as attacking lower levels. And these people just can't understand why everyone's so mad at them, right? And so the dynamic part of Graves' theory is that if you have this kind of dynamic, the people you're trying to help aren't even going to listen. They will enter a closed state. And so if you want to figure out a solution, you have to figure out how to open them up, and that's the second part of this. And so there's a couple of principles, and we don't have. I mean, I'm not trying to recommend a solution to our political problem at the moment, but the theory would say, and some of the evidence would say, just to use some terminology from the current Graves generation, it's level, this seventh level, the yellow level, is about meshworks. It's about making something that's better, but that works for all the other levels. So you don't want to lose the individuals, forcing them into some kind of communal thing. You have to bring them along and talk about how the network works together. So it's a meshwork rather than a melting pot. So just a metaphor there. It's kind of a long discussion around dominator hierarchies, but a value environmental quality might be a higher value, but it's not going to be perceived that way if it is forced upon you. You have to be educated that there's something in this for you. There's a term holarchy for in higher levels encompassing lower levels in a kind of less damaging way. As I like to tell the Bernie bros, you may be right on the issues, but those other guys aren't listening to you. But if you are really representing those higher values, you kind of have to act like it. You have to be the adult in the room, and you have to put a little extra effort into that communication and not just say, you guys are destroying the planet. You guys are, anti-women. You can't just, even though manifestly it's true, it won't work to change anybody's mind. So let me stop there. Does that make a little bit of sense as an example?
If I think one of the great things about spiral dynamics is that as we study it, we learn the values associated with each group, with each meme, what they value, what their worldview is and what they value. And and the values are good, right? They always start out with a good solution and then they become a little too extreme. But if you can speak to them according to what they value, and help them to see how their values can be fulfilled by, whatever you're trying to say, then you can reach them, right? Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Just Gloria, I think I'm kind of on a good time track. Coming towards the last third of the presentation. So what does all this have to do with collective consciousness? Well, as an emergent model, it predicts, it not only characterizes kind of what the current situation is and the current center of gravity for the communities are, but proposes that you can predict that there will be higher stages. And again, not only for an individual, but for society as a whole. And that societies will, over time, have a higher percentage of the community at higher stages if life conditions allow and are preserved. In these higher stages, almost interestingly enough, emerge out of stress and turmoil. So think back to the Black Plague and leading to the Renaissance. That's the kind of global life condition that causes change. It gets everybody to see that, change is needed here. So that's a key question, is whether this pandemic is going to have that, is being perceived the same way across the board. And I think that's up in the air right now. If you think about, people wanted to just, I'm tired of sheltering, I want to go out and party and not wear a mask. Is that just good TV, or is there a significant part of the population that is thinking that way and isn't being driven by the pandemic to take the next step? I think that's an open issue. But interestingly enough, when Graves and Wilbur talk about what characterizes that eighth level, they point to Teilhard de Chardin as a model. That's what we're talking about. That's the next level is going to be more like that. And then you again have to ask the question: is that a metaphorical, or is that more tangible than that? So that's where I come back to the technology, and so I'm going to move into a little discussion here of how technology is developing around these ideas. Maybe I should just ask one more time before, if there's any questions before I move into that. It's a different topic. Are we good?
I have a
Good.
question about I've often wondered about Teilhard's noosphere as it relates to, I know it relates to collective consciousness, but when he talks about it being a cloud around the earth, he's speaking metaphorically, right? So it's interesting how different models of collective consciousness, I mean, and that term is Jung's, right? So I don't know if it's fair to just use that as the catch-all, but what would you say is the difference between de Chardin's noosphere and, say, the morphogenetic field or Jung's collective consciousness? Are there differences?
Sure. And that's a whole nother topic. It is. So all I can say is, I spent a lot of time looking through the works of Jung, and he talks a lot about archetypes, and that's where the collective consciousness kind of emerges from his work. He doesn't spend a lot of time. It's as if these archetypes spring out of this collective consciousness that's sort of this substrate. And I haven't seen much more detail than that. We have a Jungian on the call. Maybe there's more.
Yeah, I think of Jung's collective consciousness as like an analogy to the genetic code, so that by virtue of the fact that we're born human, our genetic code assures that our anatomy is such that we have one head, two arms, two legs, etc. And by virtue of the fact of being born human, the collective unconscious assures that we have certain archetypal needs and propensities and that kind of thing, so that we all have a need to be loved. We all have a need to love. We all have tendencies to get angry at certain things and that kind of thing. All the archetypal energetic patterns that we share. So that's how I kind of describe the collective unconscious.
Yeah, I think that's fair up to a point. When I think of the morphogenetic field, and I read Sheldrake a long time ago, there's a pattern that he can't quite define where that lives. Is it in the atmosphere? Is it in the common biology? But that then it's sort of a template into which development grows, right? And so that sounds more genetic than the noosphere. That's biosphere in Teilhard's terminology. I think so. When you get to noosphere, I think he was meaning to be literal. He wasn't, and so that's why I think he was interested in the technology, because that was a tangible thing that sort of reinforced what would tie this together. And he talked about it in geosphere, biosphere, noosphere. I mean, they're all physical terms as a scientist, and to him. and that's what I'm groping towards still. So I'm sort of not, I guess, interested in the metaphorical conversation. I'm trying to say, is there something tangible that we can talk about that supports the metaphors?
Right.
And I think in that sense, I'm the same as Teilhard. I'm interested in how technology kind of reflects that.
Yeah.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah. I always felt that the World Wide Web was kind of precursor or prefiguring our ability to connect on a telepathic level.
Yeah. So let's keep going, because I want to come back to that exact point. Because the World Wide Web has its benefits and its problems, right? But I'm glad you're all on an internet call too. So that's one of the benefits. So again, so technology is one manifestation of some of these models, whether they're societal or behavioral. And so I just felt it was natural to, again, intuitively, 30 years ago, that this internet development would make more tangible and more visible the common commonsense. And I think that statement alone is kind of hard to argue with. I think it has been that. But what exactly is the nature of a global brain that is partly developed on the technology itself, right? So is it just a good analogy, or is it something more physical than that? So this is where we open up to the group again for some quick responses to these two questions. So this is not a question, by the way, of is technology bad or good. It's does technology stitch us together in a collective sense? And if you have an example of why that's true, say it. And if you have an example of why it's not true, maybe say that. Let's try to do this one quickly. Gloria, you go first again.
Well, I think that the interesting thing about social isolation is that in many cases it has brought us back together. It has brought us together through technology, because the very fact that we are physically isolated emphasizes our need for community and for, to connect with each other. And so we find ways through technology to do that, So an example would be, having dinner together with the family, even though they're all over the country, having a time to be able to be together online, on Zoom, see each other, talk to each other, visit, catch up.
Okay.
Anybody else? Hey, Gabe.
Hey, Gabe.
Gabe is here. What do you think?
Hey, how are you, everybody? I'm sorry I had to get on here late. I was driving through the mountains back to Boulder, and it was the soonest I could get on, but I'm planning to watch the recording of the first part. But I was going to say I agree with your points. I think it's interesting because, and Don, we may have talked about this before, but I feel like technology obviously has created a number of problems related to things like social interaction, in terms of people maybe not always feeling so connected, and they're kind of interacting through Facebook and this kind of thing. And we have high levels of depression and people feeling lonely, like here in the United States. But at the same time, I think it's also obvious it's had a very powerful effect, especially I think in terms of connecting ideas together and people's exposure to other cultures and information and things like this. So yeah, I think it definitely fits that definition of double-edged sword in many ways. But the good thing is I think we're directing it. So roughly, I don't know if we're directing all of it, but we're directing some of the technological development, of course, and its cultural adaptation. So hopefully we can get it so we get more of the positive and less of the negative, and the connections get stronger in the right way. But yeah, well, anyway, that's my quick thought. I was kind of doodling, trying to fix my camera, so I don't know if I missed anything here. But
it's good. Sorry to put you on the spot. But
Yeah, no worries.
Others?
Anyone else?
Just today listening to Nelson Mandela's The Long Walk to Freedom. And, you know, he was imprisoned in the 62 or early 60s, and he got out like in 1990. And the technology had changed so much in that time. He was shocked. He went on this world tour afterwards. So, of course, transportation had changed, but he had to stop at the North Pole just as a stopover to keep going, refueling stop. And there were these Inuit natives, you know, Eskimos at the fence, and they knew about his struggle. And he was just shocked, and so it was really heartwarming to him that young people around the world, you know, knew about this inequality and this racism, and they were, and of course they had been subjected to similar things. So it just really made me think, wow, it's wonderful that we're all connected like that. So we can, it's not exactly your question. Does it bring us together? It brings
That's good.
issues together, or, you know, celebrates it. It's not like touchy-feely, but it's globally, I'm just so grateful that I can learn anything I want on YouTube, you know, and that we do have this opportunity to learn now without, I don't have to be in Boulder now. I can, you know, be in Iowa and still be in this group. And it means a lot to me. It brings me together with other people.
Thanks. Others?
I'd like to share. I do agree that technology is bringing us together. I think one of the concerns I have is really for children, because they are spending so much time on technology, and are having difficulty just having regular conversations with people about other subjects. So I guess I'm kind of hoping this comes to a close at some point, and we gain some normalcy and get back to the practice of greater communication, so that you know, some of the businesses have said, you know, we can teach children how to use technology, but we can't teach them how to get along and how to communicate with one another.
Mm-hmm. That's a great thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other offerings? So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, one thing about technology is, as it began for us to be interconnected, there wasn't a real good concept of like spiral dynamics, different methods of communication, different goals, different worldviews, and that sort of thing. And in the internet now, we find a coalescence is a kind word, but sometimes it's sort of just a mush of misunderstanding, because so many people can communicate without any of the cues that come from individual to individual communication. So it's almost like you wish you could dial into you could kind of set your parameters. So if you use spiral dynamics, you know, I want to have a green conversation, then you have people who are on the same kind of the same wavelength, and you're not battling or offending people who are in another arena without knowing it. I mean, it's obviously good for all of us to communicate, but it's important to be able to understand where the other people are coming from, so that we don't just destroy the possibility of true communication rather than enhance it.
That's awesome. That's like a business model for an application.
Yeah.
You know, seriously. Thanks, Kath. Okay. I think we've got 20 minutes left. Let's try to get to one more section here. Again, I'm a technology guy, so I think a lot about the technology piece. I don't think it's so important that I go through this in much detail because I want to get to the personal work at the end. But there's different aspects of how technology is developing that sheer physical interconnection is happening. And I put this table together in 2005 for the book that I published, and I had no idea it would that 2015 would look so much different. That the growth would be so massive, and even the idea that I had to have a category back then, 20 years ago, for how many network connections, how many computers are actually connected to the internet. That was a statistic. It's like now, well, they all are now, and so, and then the smartphone wasn't even on the radar then. So these things are happening at an incredibly accelerating pace, and it kind of begs the question of what more technology could contribute to, and that's kind of where I'm trying to head. So, awareness. So technology. So there's awareness on a personal level, and tuning into not just your sensory information, but your internal information and your spiritual information. That's kind of where I historically came from in terms of thinking about awareness. Over time, I'm thinking that technology helps you be aware of more things as well. And classic stuff in the 20th century, only 20 years ago, was there weren't a lot of global technologies that were changing things. In the 21st century, that's all changed. Sensor networks are becoming prevalent. That's a graphic of Boulder Creek, which has been flooding recently. But that's online, that's available. So you can have an awareness or at least more depth of awareness to the environment you're in using technology, and having not only your five senses, but some senses out there in the world that you can access and keep track of. And then just more generally, the digital changes, how Moore's law is driving computing power and things like machine learning and what that can do. All of that, two-edged sword. As always, there's new life conditions also bring new problems, and so awareness versus surveillance, privacy versus social. Years ago, privacy of internet communications was an issue that came that I was involved in, sort of in the public policy world, and I used to think to myself, people are desperately trying to protect their privacy, that I should not know what their email address is, and then I look over here and there's this social media has emerged, and everybody can't wait to give you all the information about their personal life. It's like, why is privacy an issue again? It's you get both sides as you evolve technologically. So this is what I wanted to hit on, just as the two-edged sword of technology is the last one. So Facebook caught everyone by storm, and then a lot of other social media examples, Twitter and others. And it was, largely the privacy issues almost got just overwhelmed in a tidal wave. Nobody cared. It was like, I want to share. I want to put more pictures up. And I think it's only really hit us in the 2016 election. And so getting back to the initial thing that I talked about, which is the weird feeling I had when the pandemic took hold, and the weird feeling I had at 9/11, I saw it on Mark Zuckerberg's face in about January of 2017, when it became clear that the Russians had been working to support the Trump election, and doing it because they understood what the underlying dynamic of Facebook was that it would drive extremes. I hope this is all kind of, I think you all know this. And there was sort of this news interview that I saw. I wish I could find the video of this. I'm still looking for it. Is interview with Mark Zuckerberg. And what do you think of this, Mark? This great thing you've created has turned against us. And he just had this. Guys like that are not often taken unawares. He's got handlers. He's got a public relations machine, and he just looked like, this is something that I didn't even know about my own creation. It has just emerged. Where did this come from? And probably a month later, he was testifying before Congress, and he looked like himself, and he had his talking points, you know, and that moment was over. Did someone have a comment there? Sorry. So, yet another kind of emergent moment that I'm thinking a lot about these days. Moore's law continues to drive down the cost of computing power and increasing the capability of it. And that trend has hit the medical community. And so I'm extremely interested in, the upper left is me wearing what's called a Muse headband that records brain waves at a fairly crude level, but enough that people use it as a meditation aid. And there's more of these all the time. And so generally they're consumer priced EEG devices. So if you think of what an EEG can do to diagnose concussions or Alzheimer's and how that feeds into treatment, that technology was going to be democratized, just like the computer was. And so I think that's a pretty interesting thing. And if you kind of think about it, more and more, so the third bullet point here is the high-end EEG equipment has helped develop a very detailed model of the brain and what parts of the brain kind of do what. So, brain activity, brain firing of neurons associated with me waving my hand, motor skills, walking. Those are getting to be more and more well understood, such that you can translate the EEG command to shake hands with a device that's not physically connected, right? A prosthetic, and you can control it in some detail because we understand the brain that well. Increasingly, there are maps of, where do memories happen or how do they come together? That's getting more well understood. And so you sort of extrapolate from that and take some leaps of faith, and you can decide, where does the brain, as we conventionally understand it, leave off, and where does mind or consciousness begin? So at the end of the day, I'm what would I call it? A spiritualist, and I believe there is something that is non-physical about us, and yet I want the science to kind of take me there. And where does one end and one leave off, and how far can you push that? So I think that's a whole area of research that is going to happen faster in the near future because the technology is getting us to a point where we can do more with that. The problem is define, now tell me what consciousness is. Okay, so raise your hand if you know what consciousness is. Okay, nobody. So I was hoping you guys could help me out on that one, but
Awareness.
So there's ways to think about it. I think this audience all thinks about it, and I've all thought of it and keep thinking about it. In the scientific world, there's this series of conferences that have come together precisely to try to figure that out. And basically, what's the difference, right? So it's brain scientists, neuroscientists, it's philosophers, it's technologists, and they kind of argue about, and there's two poles to the question, right? There's people who say and still say, it's the brain. Everything you think about as consciousness is I can show you where that is in the brain, or soon I'll be able to, and that's the end of the story. And there are those who say, and so the key point on this group is a philosopher from the University of Arizona, Dave Chalmers, came up with this distinction. He said, well, what you just said, scientist, is true of what I would call the easy problem of consciousness. So, where in the brain is sense of smell, where are the memories? Yeah, we're kind of getting that. But nothing of what you're telling me, excuse me, now I'm thinking about myself, Dave Chalmers, and who I am and what it feels like to have these thoughts. Where's that in the brain? And nobody can answer that question, right? And it makes kind of the materialists very, very mad. Well, I can't yet, but I'm gonna. And so to me, that's a challenge. And it's like, okay, well, let's push the technology and show me that you can get there, and then I'll believe you. but I'm not sure you're going to get there. So this group, and this, I would point you to this group, and even if you ever get a chance to go, they have a conference every other year. It's phenomenal because it's all of these theorists on all these kinds of approaches, whether it's, some people just still, the mind's something, the body's something different, and you can never, it's a duality, you can never reconcile them. Others, I love the panpsychism, right? Consciousness is fundamental to matter. It just doesn't look the way you think it looks when it's a human. Quantum physics gets brought in. Because at the thought level, it's a subatomic process, and so quantum physics enters into the picture, is actually relevant and enables a lot of things. I think, Gloria, I think you've had people on your various presentations talk about this and how there's the best models of quantum physics would tell you that we are living partly in an observer-created universe. The mind interacts with matter at that level. So that's another one that's represented in this group. So I actually have a poster session at this conference next year. It was going to be in April, now it's going to be in December, where I'm going to kind of make the point that I don't have that answer, but I have a technique driven by better measurement of the brain to get us closer to, can we get closer to it? So that's just to mention in passing.
Don, can you
Yep.
tell us what Moore's law is?
Moore's law in computer science is a guy named Gordon Moore from Intel kind of figured out back in the 50s, early 60s, that computer chips were improving in power and dropping in price over time. And it was happening so regular, sort of every 18 months. I now forget the formula. Computers are 10 times more powerful and 10 times less expensive, something like that. So the curve, and so that's the curve we've been on that led to microcomputers and now to smartphones. And so, sorry, that's a.
I see.
So personal experience, this is where I want to close. Let's see. Let me come back to a question for the group, but if there is a collective consciousness, how does it happen? Have you ever experienced? So there's techniques, and somebody on. I've got some background noise coming. So there's different techniques around just conscious awareness that have been around for millennia, like meditation. So there's different tools to get there, right? And as you become more aware of your own consciousness, the question is, can you strengthen the connection between yours and another's? And so I'm wondering, back to this slide, is if anybody would care to share experiences of a small scale group mind or even of collective consciousness. So part of the reason I want to do this with Caritas is this is a pretty personal question, and I feel like for me this is a pretty safe space. So and I suspect a lot of you do. So if you do and you want to share on this, I'd love to hear from you. I had certain experiences early on in my young adult life around psychedelic drugs. I think that's not uncommon, and have this sense of group mind or even larger experiences. Came down and kind of wondered, well, wait a minute, what happened? Why isn't that still with me? And so that's part of a states of consciousness that are temporary versus stages of growth that can be more permanent. So that's kind of my one example for me. And there's been others, the nature mediated experiences I would put in that category as well. Mm-hmm. So does anyone kind of want to give some examples? Maybe they're personal, maybe they're people you know.
Okay, if we're going to go way back, I'll do a good one.
Okay.
Not John. I was married before John, so we're not talking about him. But a group of us, first years of college, were smoking some dope, but nothing heavy. And we were in a room, and there were 12 of us, or 15 maybe, but and my husband was along a wall over here. And we were just talking, nobody's singing, there's no altered state thing other than just smoking a little. And everyone in the room saw him tilt out of the wall and disappear. I mean, it wasn't like they just said, oh, he disappeared. Everybody saw head, then torso, and then he slid out of the wall. And we all waited. I mean, you know, everybody had the good sense not to break the whatever it was. And soon he came back, tilted right back in the wall. Literally everyone in the room had some explanation of it that was, you know, it was not a made up thing. Now, could have been, you know, group screw up, I don't know, but very, you know, very strange experience.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one experience the most profound experiences I've had personally around group mind, or, you know, around oneness, has been through meditation, of course. But on a more, you know, mundane level, I did an experiment once with a dream group. I had read about attempts by dream groups to have a collective dream, and I had read one account about that where this group had decided to meet on a certain night at the Statue of Liberty. And, you know, most of the group, I don't think got there or didn't remember dreaming of being there. But there was one person in the group who, when they came back together in their group to report what they had experienced, one person said, well, I was at the Statue of Liberty, but I couldn't see anything. It was all dark. And this other person said, well, I went there and I was told to turn off all the lights, so I did. So I thought that was interesting, and I decided, you know, our dream group should do an experiment. And so I was just about to leave for Brazil, but we decided on a date during which I'd be in Brazil, but I didn't think that would matter. And we were going to meet in the kitchen of a friend of mine whose house we were meeting at, you know, as a group. And so we were going to meet in the kitchen and see how many people got there and see what we would do. And so on the specified night, I dreamed that I was in the kitchen and I was baking cookies with my daughter. And it was the right kitchen, except my daughter, who was not in the dream group, was there, but I didn't see anyone in the dream group. And I think one other person said that they were in the kitchen, but I can't remember. They had a different experience. And, you know, and I said, well, you know, I came all the way from Brazil and you guys didn't show up. But anyway, I think it's an interesting, you know, thing to try. Mm-hmm. Intention.
So when you're talking about collective consciousness, you know, that's not particularly samadhi. That's, you know, it sounds more like the astral plane or the celestial plane or something like that, if you're talking about it from a more spiritual perspective, because collective sounds like we're keeping our individual identities still. I mean, group mind, obviously we're keeping our individual identities. Collective consciousness, are you suggesting that we maintain our identities, and we're just going more from a superficial level into a whatever, divine inspiration, but interpreted in different ways through different people. I mean, I'm not sure I understand what collective consciousness would be.
So that's a great answer to my question, because I don't know. I don't know either. That's kind of the point. I have. It goes to that earlier question I said, where does a neuron know it's part of a brain? Same thing. If I get to that higher state, and I would argue I've been in that, I'm not recognizing other individuals in there.
Yeah,
And
that's my.
that is supposed to be. If that's what that's supposed to be, then you wouldn't know. And maybe that's the limits of what we can know. I don't. That's kind of my ultimate question here. I don't know.
And rather than limits, maybe that's the birth of what we really are.
Another good point. I have had mixed with that kind of a feeling a certain amount of fear, and it's sort of the fear of losing, right? And that's ego loss, right?
I'm on the other side. I understand what you're saying.
Right. So maybe you're at the 9th level, and yeah.
Well, no, we're not talking about hierarchies here. We're just talking about our fears.
Kidding. Yeah, but that's a great. That's one of the great questions right there. Yeah,
it is.
I'm gonna say this one. I felt silly even bringing it up, but when the Broncos won the Super Bowl, I felt it was this. I had this weird feeling, like before the game happened, that they were gonna win, and that it was. I felt it was something like a group mind will, like it was the will of the people. I don't know. I did feel that it was kind of a spiritual battle, and I also, I guess I maybe it's because we idolize Peyton Manning, or I don't know, but I just had this like I just felt like oh my goodness, they're going to win, and they're going to win not because they're better, but because it's like us, it's a battle between not necessarily good and evil, but greatness and goodness. I don't know. It was bizarre. I just wanted to mention it. Anyway,
yeah.
Period.
I don't find that bizarre at all. So I had this list that I made up, which included music, which is another piece, whether you're singing, playing it yourself, or in a place where it's being played. Certainly I've had very strong feelings of community in that context, and sports is actually one too. It's an interesting exercise in focus, a common focus on a thing. And if there's something to what I'm thinking here, that's just as good a place for that to happen as any.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch if you're in a movie theater and the movie is particularly powerful, emotionally or ideologically, maybe, there is, and then they suddenly turn the lights on and everyone's kind of shaken up, that's also a communal feeling.
Mm-hmm. I want to throw one thing out, which is the tech, again, because I'm a techie. But that headset, the Muse headset that I use, is their business model. It costs about $200 now, $250, and now comes with tapes of guided meditations. And so their business model is entirely helping people meditate, giving them some positive feedback. Your brain waves are kind of lowering, calming out. You can see it. I didn't know if am I doing it right, and so that's a interesting thing. And then some friends, Gabe and I know a guy who was actually trying to work with a multiple people using a device at the same time and seeing if you could literally sync up the brain waves. So I think that's an interesting kind of research angle.
Yeah, that coherence between heart and mind. The heart, you know, my heart, your mind, your heart, my mind, is a very powerful thing when it comes about, when two people feel that. And of course, it would be even more powerful if it was a group of people. I've never experienced it on that level with a group of people, but I have experienced it one-on-one. And it's where you do become one person. Like, there's no more separation. There's just one entity. And it's very powerful. And it's not, I guess it could be fear-producing, but if you're coming to it from a spiritual perspective of, actually, we are one, and I want to experience that. It doesn't mean I'm not going to go back to being an individual, but I want to experience it. And so let's do it, you know. And it's just a question of opening, you know. I don't know. It's hard to explain in non-physical terms, but I mean non-spiritual terms. But for me, it's just opening inside, like you open to anything, right? Like if you see a beautiful sunset and you open to it, you really feel uplifted, right? So you're opening to this other person, but you're just going deeper and deeper and deeper in this opening. And then suddenly, and if you're both doing that, then suddenly it's like this incredible coherence and oneness can take place, which is quite powerful and also very uplifting.
Cool. Just a point, just a note, interestingly, when I talk to, because I've been talking more to sort of cognitive scientists and doctors who are studying the brain, and I say, well, so you use an EEG, and they say, well, yeah, but also the heart rate variability is important. It's the mind. It's almost if they already have decided it's not just in the brain. Yeah.
No, it's more the heart in terms of that. It's much more the heart than the brain.
So I think we're out of time. I wanted to mention this unify.com. I just came across that from a friend that, so global, in this case, global synchronized meditation. They set it up for the first day of every month at a certain time and just ask people to all meditate with some intention. Have any, do we have experienced meditators in this group? Anybody?
I think we're all experienced
All of you?
meditators.
Yeah. I've been complaining to Gabe that I would love to be, but I'm not very good at it. That's why I got this Muse device. It gets me to actually go do it. So there's something to be said for that. So that's, you know, it seems to me that's a interesting possibility there. I think that's, I love this diagram. This is from recent research with people, kind of a three-dimensional rendering of brain activity with and without psychedelics. And that's kind of interesting. I always thought that was true, but there you go. And then we don't really have time to do this, but, you know, one of the things that Teilhard would have said is more and more people is going to raise the temperature of thought on the planet. And
Temperature of thought?
Yeah, temperature of thought. Remember, and he thought he was being literal. This is where I'm still trying to figure the guy out. But his point was that the larger the population of thinking beings, the more likely to get this noosphere, this thinking layer.
I see. Is that an accurate figure on the world population? It's all sevens right now?
we just passed that number. Yeah, that's a screenshot. Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. It came up faster than I thought.
Interesting.
But projection is 10 billion by 2050. Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm going to make it, but interesting. So my closing thought there is, so without having proof, I expect there to be an emergence of collective consciousness in that kind of time frame. And just to remember that, the life conditions change and that it's not like problems go away. And autopoiesis is just a term for self-organizing. It is, if you get enough, this is a guy who just theorized that if you get enough complexity in a brain, enough neurons and enough interconnections, that will self-organize into consciousness. That's where consciousness comes from. And if that's the case, then to the earlier back and forth, you don't know what's going to happen when you get there, what will happen to the individual. So good to be humble on these kinds of things. That's all I got. Thank you, everybody.
Those deaths include all the pandemic deaths?
I have no idea. That was not long ago. I was saying 2 weeks ago. It hit, maybe 3 weeks ago. It hit that number. So some are in there. Sure. I don't. There's no variability in these numbers detail.
Well, thank you so much, Don. This has been a really interesting, thought-provoking presentation.